Every time you fill your car, something almost magical happens. You squeeze the handle, fuel flows into the tank, and then click. It stops at almost the perfect moment. No overflowing, no warning, just one clean click. But here's the strange part. Your car never tells the pump that the tank is full. There isn't a wire connecting them. There isn't a sensor inside your fuel tank sending a signal back to the nozzle. In fact, most fuel nozzles don't communicate with your car at all. So how can a piece of metal in your hand know exactly when to stop pumping? If you've ever looked closely at the end of a fuel nozzle, you may have noticed something unusual. Besides the large opening where the fuel comes out, there's also a tiny hole near the tip. It's so small that most people never notice it, but that little hole is doing almost all the thinking. While you're pumping fuel, that tiny hole constantly pulls in air. Inside the nozzle, it's connected to a narrow tube that leads to a small chamber. As long as air keeps flowing through that tube, everything stays exactly as it should. The handle remains locked, fuel keeps flowing, and nothing happens. But that tiny stream of air is actually the only thing preventing the nozzle from shutting itself off. The moment that airflow disappears, the entire mechanism changes in less than a second. And the reason that happens has nothing to do with electronics. It all comes down to one of the most useful tricks in physics. Inside the nozzle, fuel doesn't simply flow through an empty pipe. At one point, it passes through a narrow section. As the passage gets smaller, the fuel has to speed up. And whenever a fluid speeds up through a tight space, its pressure drops. That drop in pressure creates a small vacuum inside the nozzle. While air is still entering through the tiny hole near the tip, that vacuum stays balanced. Fresh air continuously flows through the sensing tube, preventing the vacuum from becoming strong enough to trigger anything. Everything changes when the fuel level rises high enough to cover that tiny hole. The moment the hole is submerged, air can no longer enter the tube. Instead of pulling fresh air, the Venturi vacuum suddenly begins pulling on a sealed line. In an instant, the vacuum becomes much stronger because there's no incoming air to equalize the pressure. That stronger vacuum acts on a flexible rubber diaphragm hidden inside the nozzle. Normally, the diaphragm barely moves. But as soon as the pressure difference becomes large enough, it snaps inward with surprising force. And that tiny movement is enough to release a mechanical latch that's been holding the handle open the entire time. No electronics, no computer, no sensor inside your car. Just air, pressure, and a cleverly designed mechanical system that's been quietly working every time you've filled a tank. The instant that latch is released, a spring inside the handle takes over. It forces the handle back to its original position, shutting off the fuel flow almost immediately. That's the familiar click you hear every time the tank is full. The entire sequence, from the tiny hole being covered to the fuel stopping, usually takes only a fraction of a second. Fast enough to prevent fuel from overflowing, yet simple enough to work without electricity or software. Of course, you've probably seen pumps stop even when the tank isn't full. That's because the nozzle isn't actually detecting a full tank. It only detects when the airflow through that tiny hole is interrupted. If fuel splashes back toward the nozzle, if the nozzle isn't inserted properly, or if fuel rushes into the tank faster than air can escape, liquid can briefly cover the sensing hole. To the nozzle, it looks exactly the same as a full tank. The airflow disappears, the vacuum increases, the latch releases, and the pump shuts off. That's why squeezing the handle all the way isn't always the fastest way to fill your tank. On some vehicles, slowing the flow gives air more time to escape, reducing splashback and making those annoying premature clicks much less likely. In other words, the nozzle isn't reading your fuel gauge. It's simply reacting to what happens at the very tip of the nozzle, using nothing more than the movement of air. What's even more impressive is that this design has remained almost unchanged for decades. It doesn't need batteries, software updates, or a connection to your car. As long as fuel flows, air can move, and pressure behaves the way physics says it should, the nozzle will keep doing its job. That's why the same basic mechanism works on millions of fuel pumps around the world, in different countries, on different vehicles, and with different types of fuel. It's a solution that's simple, reliable, and remarkably difficult to improve. So the next time you're filling your tank and you hear that familiar click, remember what actually happened. A tiny hole, no bigger than a pinhead, was quietly pulling in air. The rising fuel blocked it for just a moment. A small vacuum became strong enough to pull a rubber diaphragm. That diaphragm released a latch. A spring snapped the handle shut, and the flow of fuel stopped, all in less than a second. No electronics, no communication with your car, just one brilliantly engineered mechanism hiding inside something millions of people hold every day without ever giving it a second thought. Sometimes, the smartest inventions aren't the ones that look complicated. They're the ones you never even notice until you look twice.